Hello Rifters, welcome to yet another Rogue PvP guide. As always, I'll go through the spec itself and the rotation, and I haven't bothered with any crawl alerts with the spec, just because they're not really needed. So let's get straight into it. The spec itself is 41 Tactician and 35 Marksman. I'll leave this open for a few moments so that you can pause the video and just take a note of where I've put all of my points. So basically this build is an AoE spec with reasonable 1v1 skills as well, and it has a small bit of healing, so it can just help you to sustain during fights, but it can also give you or your teammates small buffs, or your enemies debuffs. So it's quite a useful build. So by now you should have had time to pause the video if you needed. So there's the spec, and now we'll go straight into the abilities. So we have Glacial Torrent and Infernal Torrent as your main two abilities. These are going to be basically all of your main damage, and you then have Necrotic Torrent. I'll go through when you're going to want to use these at a later stage. Empyrean Bolt, which is going to be your builder for your combo points. Infernal Beam for the damage over time, and Necrotic Bolt just for that instant damage, which does quite a lot. On the Double and Shadow Shift are your two abilities to help you to get away. Your three finishers are Torrent Primer, which is very useful because it removes all the stacks of your torrent overload and also does increase the damage and healing of your torrents. Empyrean Ray, which is a single target finisher which deals quite a lot of damage, and your Necrotic Ray, which deals damage up to 8 enemies, so that's going to be an AoE finisher. You then have three remotes. The first one is Battle Remote, increases damage and healing by 20% for 10 seconds. This is very useful during fights. Barrier Remote, which gives you a small shield, and Curative Remote, which will debuff the target and you will heal each time you hit them. So it's quite useful. You then also have three cores. Curative Core, so you basically set up a core and it will heal you over time. Necrotic Core, which will deal damage over time to the enemy if they're nearby, and a Power Core, which will debuff the nearby enemies, and they will take more damage for a certain amount of time. And then your final ability that you're going to want to use during fights is Deaden, which is just an interrupt and then silences for 5 seconds if successful, so that's quite useful to interrupt any of the healer's healing abilities and can get you a few extra kills. You then have some buffs from Marksman. First one is Random Munitions, and the second is Electrified Munitions. Because you can have two of these Marksman buffs on at the same time, you can have both on, so let's activate them now. As you can see, I can have both. That isn't part of the spec. The Curative Engine, so you've got two engines that you might want to use. So Curative Engine, which is going to heal you each time the enemy hits you, and then Necrotic Engine, which will deal damage each time the enemy hits you. But it will also increase your damage of bolts and rays, as it says, by 30%, but reduces damage of your torrents by 30%. Now only one of these engines can be on at a time, so during PvP most of the time it's going to be Curative Engine, and you're just going to want to activate this when your opponent is getting slightly low, and you can use Necrotic Bolt 24/7 without a cooldown. So there are all the useful abilities within the spec, and we'll now move on to the rotation. Now the rotation is pretty simple, and you can vary it depending on your own playstyles. An example of my rotation would be Infernal Beam into Necrotic Bolt, Glacial Torrent, Infernal Torrent, then into Empyrean Bolt. Once that first rotation is done, I will simply go Glacial, back into Infernal Torrent, and then Imperium Bolt, and I should then have 5 combo points, so I can then use a finisher. Now the finisher that you're going to use is going to depend on the situation. You can use Torrent Primer if you want to get rid of your stacks and increase your damage and healing. Imperium Ray if you need a quick burst damage on one of your targets to try and finish them off before they finish you off. Or Necrotic Ray for a lot of AoE damage to your opponents, which can be hard to heal with sometimes in PvP, depending on when you use that ability. And once you've done that first lot of finishes, you basically just rinse and repeat. So I would go, let's go Infernal Beam, Necrotic Bolt, Glacial Torrent, Infernal Torrent, into Imperium Bolt. I now have 3 points. Glacial Torrent, back into Infernal, back into the Bolt, and then Finisher. And then you have no stacks left. And then you just simply hop between Glacial, Infernal. You can use the Bolt here now if you want, but it's easier if you just go 4 in a row, and then use the Bolt and you'll instantly have 5, and then you can just go for a massive burst of damage. So this build is reasonably good at 1v1ing, but it's a lot better for AoE groups. Now whilst you're during the fight, you still have these 6 other abilities that you can use. So if you know that the fight's going to be a close one, or if it's just going to be a long one, you might want some healing over time, just so you can get a small edge over your opponent, even though it's not much of a restoration. It's still a bit, and that just helps anyway. Necrotic Core, if the target is melee and they're raping you around you, you can just place this down and deal some damage to them over time. And then the Power Core, which is just going to mean that you deal more damage, but remember it has to be near the enemies to have the effect. So you can use any one of them. I would just prefer to use the healing one, just so I know that I have some heals coming in. You then have your 3 emotes. Now basically you're going to constantly have one remote up. So I would start with Battle Remote because it has the longest cooldown, and it does also increase your damage and healing by 20%, which is quite a lot. I'd then go into Barrier Remote because you just gain a small shield, and during a 1v1 fight that shield will just last for a few seconds and will just help you to get out more DPS on your opponent whilst they're taking down your shield. And then that also has a 1 minute cooldown, and then you want to go straight into Curative Remote, just so you can heal up that extra bit. And then obviously you use your Deaden whenever appropriate. So if you're fighting against a mage, whenever they cast in a powerful spell or whatever, just make sure you use Deaden and interrupt them. And then you have your 2 getaway abilities or catch-up abilities, which you can also use when appropriate. Now I also take break free, as everyone should, just because if the enemy has any CC control, then you can just quickly use this as a utility and get away. And that brings an end to this video. I really hope that this has helped some of you and that you can use this build in PvP. As always, thanks for watching. Please leave any constructive criticism in the comment section below, or hit that subscribe button if you wish to see more of my videos. Peace out!